speaking of trust and honesty, um, there's something I have to tell you.
Okay.
One of the first contestants on the show this new season that I found interesting was Jared. He talks about feeling pretty excited for this opportunity, for the promise that the show entails, because as he describes himself, he's a smaller guy, and he notes that he describes himself as being the smallest guy in the room, which I'm actually not even that sure that is objectively accurate. Him and Milton look about the same size. And so it's interesting, though, that this is part of his description of himself, that he sees this as a critical component of himself. And as he describes, this is something that, in his perspective, has been a deterrent for him in dating, is that he imagines that women want guys who are bigger, who are taller, who are stronger, and that is the reason that is one of the critical reasons that he's been unsuccessful in dating. And so that's interesting because that could, right, be definitely true. And so we can definitely acknowledge the ideas of masculinity in society that does reinforce, right, muscular build, height, those kind of things. But it is interesting, though, because I think Jared, we can also look at him as a case of potentially a self fulfilling prophecy. Is that for him, and maybe this comes from early rejections in dating, but he has internalized this idea that he is unattractive, right? Undesirable, even to women, because he makes these assumptions that Vanessa even asks him, do women say to you that, I'm not interested because you're too small? And he says something that along the lines of, he can tell, right? And so we see here that maybe more assumption than even reality. And so I wonder how Jared shows up in dating, in a dating space, that in a social setting, does he show up with inhibitions? Does he show up expecting rejection? And the interesting thing about our brains and the psychology of us as humans is we will inadvertently create the exact thing that we anticipate happening. So if Jared is expecting that he's going to be rejected, if he is perceiving interactions that other men are getting more attention because they look differently than he does, I wonder how that presents. That maybe when he's talking with women, it's not with confidence. Maybe when he's talking, he's already having some kind of negative energy because he's anticipating being rejected. That if you expect that you're going to be rejected, it makes it hard for you to maintain positive energy. And so I wonder if maybe that's part of his experience. And so I just thought that, just 2 minutes in, we already have an interesting case study here of some of the issues and some of the profound insecurities that people come into this experiment with. Oh, Lydia. So, Lydia is very interesting for a number of reasons. But in our introduction to Lydia, she talks about how she's been experienced by other people in the past. And so she says that she's often been told that she is too much. And that's a very interesting statement. It's a very loaded statement. And so this is not something that Lydia is alone in. Many people have talked about in friendships and romantic relationships that this is a theme that's come up for them, is that the other person, gives them feedback that they are too much. And so what does this mean? So it could mean just they're incompatible. And so we know that even just on a basic level, people require different levels of energy and intensity in social interactions, what we might call introvert versus extrovert. Lydia is very objectively a very extroverted person. So could it mean that she was being paired, or she's paired herself with people who are more introverted and more likely to be overwhelmed by the intensity of her social engagement? Possibly. But also, I wonder if it's not something deeper. And about 4 minutes later, we see a little bit of maybe some of Lydia's social engagement, that if this is representation of how Lydia is in everyday conversation off camera, I could see how some people might experience it as too much. So in her conversation with Izzy, she's loud. She's louder than him. So she's not matching his energy in the same way. Also, she seems like she may have difficulty with not talking over people. So I also wonder if that's part of the difficulty that she's had in dating and maybe even in friendships as well. So in our introduction to Johnny in the pods, We get a couple contradictory statements. And so Izzy begins by saying that he's looking for someone who's emotionally stable, and this is a consistent pattern in what Izzy shares as a priority for a dating partner. And Johnny says, "Oh, yes, I like to think that I'm super stable," which wording is very interesting. I like to think that I'm super stable, right? So, what does that mean? And then shortly after that, she then says, "Well, to be honest, I have a track record of crappy relationships." So, again, the word choice is important here. So, she says crappy relationships. This is different than other contestants who said things like, "I just haven't found the right person who's the right match. I haven't really had time for dating because of work or school or other obligations." So she specifically says a track record of crappy relationships. And so with that, I'd want to know, so how many relationships fall into this category? What does this track record mean? Usually for someone to say that, I'm thinking over 3 relationships, and then crappy. I'd be curious on what this means exactly for Johnny. And so crappy seems like it goes beyond simply not being compatible. And I'm wondering about, who has she been partnered with and how problematic have some of these relationships been. And then with that, when we start thinking of someone who is acknowledging they have a track record, then there's that question of how much of this is chance? Did you just happen to be in a relationship with someone who, and then that relationship ended up being crappy? And how much of this is a reflection of something about you, right? So when we think about water meets its level. And so what this means is that people look for partners that often reflect some of their own difficulties, right? And that if she's dealing with some significant issues about herself, her worth, her identity, that someone who is kind of completely healed from that would actually maybe not seem like a compatible choice, that might be emotionally difficult for her. And so is there something about her and her perception of herself that has contributed in some way to these so-called crappy relationships that she has a track record of? I'm not really quite sure what is up with Miriam. That is a lot of evasiveness, a lot of dodginess. And I don't even know that she understands how this presents to other people, that she seems to have difficulty giving a straight answer. Everything requires this long pause. And that pause is, like Uche is experiencing, and as most of the audience is probably experiencing it, suspicious, because it's begs the question, what are we holding back and what really is the truth? She gives one answer at some point and she says something else. He asks her, "So you were thinking about going into medicine? What did you do?" And she said, "I explored a career in chemistry. I'm a scientist." So that's very interesting wording. I explored. Are you a chemist? Are you a researcher? These are all things, and it's not for lack of vocabulary. Clearly, Miriam is very intelligent, very educated. So then that again begs the question of what are we holding back and why are we holding it back? So I'm not really sure what to make of Miriam right now, but that's a concern. I'm going to be moving back to Houston pretty much in a couple weeks. Oh yeah, I already moved back. Miriam, what? And it's interesting that this conversation is happening with Uche of all people, who we already see in Uche's previous conversations, very analytic. He's not the one that's going to let that slide. He definitely notices this, and this is clearly not going to be the match. So about halfway into the first episode, we have this conversation between Chris and Johnny. And, with Chris, I can imagine that this is hard, right? That this was a very hard thing to experience. This is hard to talk about on camera. And what I hope for Chris is that as he watches this, as he watched with the rest of us, that he feels proud of himself, that he doesn't regret that this hasn't caused him issues in family relationships or anything like that. Because the unfortunate truth is that, men's experiences with sexual coercion is often minimized, is often not taken seriously. As a society, we do not do well. We do not do well enough with male victims and male survivors of all forms of sexual coercion. And so sexual coercion as a general umbrella, and this is something I can talk forever about because this is something I've done research on. This is literally what I did my dissertation on for my doctoral degree, is looking at women's and men's experiences with sexual coercion. and looking at variables that go into like how people think about their experience, how they label their experience, and how they feel after experiences, and looking at gender differences. And so this is probably something that I'll do a separate video on, just because it is one of my main areas of focus, and it's really important. And so I probably will do another video later on. But I just want to acknowledge that this was big that Chris shared this. And again, I hope that sharing this for him was a relief and not something that has led to stress and issues for him. I hope that when the audience watch this, that this is not something that people turned into a joke, but knowing humans, I'm sure there is, but I hope not. And I hope for anyone who did joke about it, it can take a step back and reflect on that, because you see him as the topic comes up, right? In the game, starts off as a game, but as the topic comes off, you see him freeze, right? That he is, and I forget how old Chris is now, right? Much older than 17, but this is still something that greatly pained him. For him to share this, for him to talk about the beginning of his sexual experiences, starting off that way, being in a situation where he was pressured to go along with sexual activity that he did not want to engage in, that this is still something that pains him, and he's not alone in that. And so again, I hope that this is something that became part of important conversations for people as they were watching this, and hopefully not jokes and dismissal or condescending comments about him and his experience. So in this later conversation with Lydia and Izzy, a couple things are interesting to me, and it's interesting to think about what people think is a selling point in relationships. So I can imagine that some of these things that they're describing that I'm going to talk about is what people would put on like their online dating website. And so Lydia says, I'm a giver, and then Izzy, says, oh, I'm selfless, I'm always people pleasing. That is interesting. And so they are saying this as this is a great thing, and they're receiving each other as if this is a great thing. But as a psychologist, I'm concerned. That for me would be a red flag, right? So what does this mean? I'm always people pleasing. That is not attractive as a partner, because that's concerns about boundaries and taking care of yourself. And so it's very fascinating that they are both presenting these characteristics like, oh yeah, this was what makes me the best partner ever. And that is instead very concerning, right? And thinking about, these are not the best characteristics. That it's, of course you want to support and provide and be there for your partner, but this idea of, always being selfless and always doing what the other person or the people want of you, that is not in fact attractive in terms of healthy relationships. And so the fact that neither one of them is concerned about this and they're both engaging in this is maybe reflecting a little bit about their previous relationships and maybe some of the issues they could have had in those. This conversation gets painfully awkward. We see here Lydia is hearing what she wants to hear, that we are seeing, and even without seeing, we're hearing the hesitation on Izzy's part, where she's like, oh, we have so much in common, we're the same, and she is just falling hard. And in that falling hard and falling blindly, irony of the show, she is not actually picking up on all the things that he's saying and not saying. He's extremely hesitant. He is very clearly, again, even sight unseen, not at all as interested, as invested as she is. But I think with Lydia, what we're going to see is that she wants so badly, and she's craving, as she says, craving so badly to have that love, to have that acceptance, that this is put her in this position of putting on blinders, that she's not, again, she's seeing what she wants to see, she's seeing what fits the fairy tale that she so badly wants to experience. And I can imagine that has led to a lot of heartbreak for her, that's led to a lot of devastation, a lot of sense of betrayal, because in her mind, this person is on the same page as her, and they're very much not. And so she's missing these cues. So again, for me, as a psychologist, the show is interesting because I think about if this is how we are on camera, right, in this experiment, on, being recorded for most of the day, what are we like off camera, and what have these previous relationships looked like? And I think we're definitely seeing a very clear picture of some of the issues Lydia's probably had. And then here's the heartbreak that was alluded to earlier with Izzy's hesitation. and he, to Izzy's point, he's honest with her. He tells her I have stronger connections elsewhere. And what does Lydia ask? She said, what do you think is missing? And what I hear from that is not just what is missing in terms of our connection, our chemistry, because that's not what she asked, right? She didn't say, oh, is it the chemistry? She says, what do you think is missing? And I think what Lydia is really asking is, what is missing in me? So if I think about Lydia's early description of herself as too much, so I think we can really summarize Lydia as too much and then not enough. That's how she has experienced relationships. That she is too much, she's over the tops, they can't handle her, and then also at the same time she's not enough. And that's a terrible position to be in, right? That this is, I think, the tear. So she's crying because of Izzy. She's crying because cameras and maybe feeling embarrassed that she was telling all the other girls. But I think that these tears and the intensity of it, it's not just because of Izzy. It's Izzy is again, right? That Izzy represents another failure for her in relationships. And so it goes beyond him. And I think that's why it's so deep, is that she felt like, okay, this would correct all the other romantic failures that she may have experienced. And so instead, it's like, here it is again. That same message again of I'm not enough and I'm too much at the same time. So too much and not enough is unfortunately, I think, what Lydia's experience has been with dating. The couple that I had hoped for. And so with Uche and Aaliyah, that was a lot. And so first there's the point of, okay, so Aaliyah chose to share this, that she didn't have to, that she chose to share that information. She chose to share it on camera, right? That this is something she could have shared later on, after, the pods, once they're together in person at some point. But she chose to share it at this point. And I think it's also interesting to think about how she presented it. So she says, she's saying like, oh, I feel like it's too perfect and things are going too well. And so essentially she presents it almost as like, let me test it. You say you care for me, you like me, you're falling, all these great things, but let me put your love to the test. And that is interesting, right? And so she puts it to the test, but then she does not like the result. Uche is a very straightforward, he's not flowery in language, he's going to just say it, bluntly. And previously Aaliyah says, right, when she's talking with the girls, oh, I love that. People always love it until it's directed towards them, and directed towards them in a way that they don't like, that doesn't feel pleasant. And so Uche is not, in my perspective, wrong for having questions, and having questions about how Aaliyah is thinking about the experience. So the cheating happened. It's happened. We cannot change it, right? And she's being truthful that this is something that she did. However, where Aaliyah seems to fall short, in my perspective, and I think this is what Uche is seeing as well, is the lack of accountability. There is a way you talk about experiences, including experiences where you messed up, that would show accountability to say, this was wrong, this is what I should have done. And I think that if Aaliyah had went about the conversation that way, it would have potentially been different, right? And so I think what ends up frustrating Uche is the lack of accountability until she's like, I have my needs too. And he's like, yeah, and then you could have ended the relationship. And so that is something I am worried about with Aaliyah, is that lack of accountability and also her ability to stay through difficult things. So as they're talking, and of course there's the awkward pauses, but she ends up leaving the room. And Uche is, as she's walking out the door, saying to her, at least the way the producers edited it, saying it to her that, you didn't have to tell me and I appreciate you telling me, and, things of that nature, but then Aaliyah's gone. And so I wonder how Aaliyah does in difficult times, that when things are not going her way, when she is, right, facing fire and facing backlash, can she withstand it? Or is she someone where at, an early sign of things not going her way, is she someone that runs away? And what has this looked like for her? And where does it come from? Is she so scared of being hurt? Is she so scared of being rejected? But I think there's definitely a lot more for us to see and explore with these two, if they will continue being these two.
Just being too overprotective, I guess, because she didn't want my sisters to end up in the same situations. I don't think she went about it the right way.
No.
So in Taylor and JP's conversation, we see the dark side of hashtag boy mom. And so the ways in which some women raise their male children differently and than their female children, and specifically having a preference or treating the male children better than the female children in a way that's very clear. And so that's what JP is describing here to Taylor, and a really, a really sad case of that. So he talked about mom would like go in there and just wake them up with aggression, wake them up with yelling and trashing their room, which is very immature behavior. And so then it's a question of what was mom going through and why is this bleeding in her relationship with her daughters. And from JP's perspective, he says that he thinks it was her being overprotective, which is, it's interesting because even as he's talking about this, and especially because from what he shares, their relationship is better now. And so he's apologizing, right? That apologizing for even talking about this. And he's giving all these disclaimers. I love her now, which the now, right, was pretty weighty there. I love her now. That I don't want to talk bad about anyone. So we get a lot of those disclaimers. And the reality is she was really awful to my sisters. And the reality is she made family life very difficult. And the reality is she took out whatever was going on with her and dad on us, right? And so on the girl specifically, and even on JP, and witnessing it and feeling like he has to step in to protect or make the girls feel better. I'm curious to see if he ends up out of the pods with Taylor or someone else, if we will meet mom and what this will look like and what she will present as, right, on camera, because it definitely sounds like one of those individuals who falls into that trap of parenting out of fear. So there's this fear of, I don't know exactly what happened with her and the husband, but that she maybe felt like she accepted less than, or maybe she felt like the things that happened, if she was tougher, it wouldn't have happened to her. So then because I'm thinking about what he says about overprotective, like what does that mean? Because that behavior, going in my room, waking me up with yelling and trashing my room and then going off to work, is the opposite of what I would call overprotective. So I'm very curious to see how she tried to explain that past and also present tense. So I'm actually interested to see if we'll get to meet JP's mom later on, because I have a couple questions for her. So Aaliyah is doing what many people do when they feel like they are now in the victim role, right? And then we can talk about whether we think that she's the victim in the situation, but she's looking for a defender. So she feels like she's being victimized. She feels like she's being attacked. She's being specifically criticized by Uche. So she's looking for a defender. So she comes back and she's talking with the other women. And we have Mars, who is presenting her with what seems like a pretty fair account, which is to say, like, if you heard that, you would be taken aback and you would need to process that. And then in direct contrast, we have Lydia. And Lydia is even like on a vendetta. And again, it's not like this is someone that she's known, for 10 years, 15 years, where this is her very best friend. For someone you just met, there's a lot of energy here in, no, he's completely wrong. Again, especially when you have another person who's saying, no, I could see that perspective, that Lydia is not offering a balanced perspective at all and is essentially like attacking Uche here, saying like, oh, he should know better. He's smart enough to know better. And he's also done this in previous relationships. Interesting. And so is this because Lydia is still dealing with her heartbreak following the rejection from Izzy? Where is this coming from exactly, Lydia? Like, what's going on? But this is a lot of energy for a situation that is not your own.
I care about you, and I think that feeling kind of scares me.
It's interesting. So Uche comes across as pretty mature. I think the audience might feel pretty split on this topic, which, makes sense given the topic. But even him apologizing, I can imagine that some viewers are like, wait, how did the tables get flipped where Leah is the victim now? But I think to Uche's point, right, that it's not about who's the victim and who's the villain, because that's not a way you enter a relationship. I think he's taking ownership for his part, which is that if he said those words, which, and again, I thought that was a pretty good apology, that if I said that, I am sorry for that, because that is not what I meant. That's a pretty mature apology, definitely a lot more mature than sorry if your feelings were hurt, right? So he's taking ownership for his part, that if I said that, I don't remember, but if I said that, then I am sorry. And he's also taking ownership of the fact that his previous relationships and experiences in those relationships may have influenced how he felt like the need to like protect himself and protect his heart. And so a lot more, probably a pretty good model for Leah of how we take ownership and how we talk about things and acknowledge other people's feelings and perspectives. And so I'm pretty impressed. Again, whether we think he should be apologizing is one thing, but I think it is admirable that he did so. So in Johnny's reveal to Izzy about her previous relationships, we see probably where the comment she said her mom made comes from. So earlier in the show, she said that her mom initially was pushing for her to be married and have kids, but has since told her in one way or another that maybe she's better off not. And so when you first hear that, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what kind of mother would say that? But now with this context, I'm wondering if the mom was coming from a place of, if the kind of relationships you're going to have are going to be these really intense negative relationships, then maybe you are better off on your own. And maybe the mom was indicating to her that she needed to take some space and heal from all of these things, because it's interesting that, and again, her wording, that this is the only person she's ever been in love with, and that she got into a marriage as a rebound, and she's sharing this with a potential marriage partner. And so, and again, when we think about Johnny's a lawyer. Johnny is smart. Johnny is good at words, right? She talks about, I think part of her job is reading contracts and wording. So it is interesting, again, that she's not realizing how this is a red flag for Izzy, right? She starts off saying, oh, if you look at my past, you're going to think I'm like 8,000 walking red flags. And, I could definitely understand why Izzy is extremely taken aback and why this is a problem from him. And from how Izzy talks, it seems like he's done a lot of reflection on himself and what he's looking for in a partner. And we can't really fault him if this is a big boundary for him, if he's concerned not just about previous marriages. He talks about his previous engagement and not wanting to be stigmatized for that, but that you entered a marriage. So then it brings the question of, what does marriage mean to her, and is that different now? Is she healed? And so it's one of those things where it leads to a lot of questions, and the answer to those questions could be a major problem. So to quote Johnny, she says, I feel like I could be capable of loving again. And that's very different. So I think that Johnny is not as ready for a committed relationship, most certainly marriage, as she wants to be. I think she wants to be healed from all of this. She wants to be ready to have a new chance, a new opportunity. But I don't actually think that she is ready. I don't think she's psychologically ready and prepared. And I think that's exactly what Izzy is picking up here, and his literal hesitation. On a completely random, just general note, I think it's very fascinating and not at all obvious that the producers have made sure in this season, at least so far, to include a lot of eating. And so in light of the criticism from some of the previous contestants, I guess, on the show, it's interesting. We see a lot of eating, a lot of focus on eating and cooking and all of this, and drinking water, and not just alcohol. So interesting. I'm really proud of Chris for how he handled the situation with Johnny and her kind of banging back with her tail between her legs, if you will. He mentioned, in his introduction on this season, that he's the one that wants the fairy tale, and he's been seeking this out. And despite the people assuming that he's like a playboy, he's very sensitive, emotionally sensitive and open. And so, I didn't know how this was going to play out, given that would he just say, okay, well, let me just accept everything. But I think it's great that he was able to say that, even though my heart is saying, yes, I want you, but I want to make sure that I'm wanted as well, and I'm not wanted simply as a second choice when the first one didn't work out. Because Johnny is very inconsistent. And so I had the concerns earlier about her saying her track record. Again, one crappy relationship, two crappy relationships is one thing. But when we start talking about a track record, that's where there's concern about, okay, how much of this is me and what am I doing that's contributing to this, or who am I attracted to, who am I, selecting to be in relationships with. And I think the behaviors we've seen from Johnny in the pod so far is suggesting that it's not just her partners that have contributed to the relationships being crappy, that Johnny has her own issues that she has to work through, and her own lessons that she has to learn that I don't think she's learned yet.
I haven't been completely honest with you.
Well, when you think the show cannot be any messier. Oh, goodness, where to start? Oh, goodness. Okay. So he's telling her now, and we are well into the deep emotional waters at this point. And this is wow. I'm trying to imagine how this felt for Aaliyah hearing it, especially not being able to have that face-to-face conversation for it. It's questioning everything. So questioning, Uche, of why are you just telling me this now? And I can imagine some reasons on his end, where he may have felt that telling her early on would have tainted the experiment. So I could see that, but it is interesting in light of how intensely he responded to the previous confession from Aaliyah about her previous relationship, that seems like that would have been the moment to say, oh, and also I need to share something with you. So with Uche, there's issues there, and with Lydia, oh man. So now this is why we need to be intentional with our behaviors, because not everything is being questioned, because all of the advice, all of the tips, all of the emotional support, and so now even to go back and rewatch it, right? Even the previous scene that they edited right before this, where, Leah's saying how much she's falling for Uche and all the great things he's telling her. And, I saw a pained reaction in Lydia, but initially I thought it was just because she wants that, because like she said, she's never felt loved. To now know that it's because of her history with Uche specifically. I can imagine that with Aaliyah, who already has issues with being vulnerable and being open and feeling like she won't be rejected for it, that this might be a violation of trust. That's a hard one. So I don't really know what their relationships, plural, look like going from here, what it looks like for Uche and Aaliyah, and recovering from this. But even with Aaliyah and Lydia, I don't know what a friendship looks like in this way. This seems like a major violation. Uche and Aaliyah are handling this, I guess, with more grace than I even expected, especially from Aaliyah. It seems like the typical response is very different than her response. A lot more gentle, a lot more perspective taken of thinking, a lot more empathy just for Lydia, than I think is maybe even would be expected in the situation. So I think that shows that she truly cares for Lydia, and she's, seeing the good in this, that she's not attacking her with all of this, or not seeming to feel a sense of betrayal, which, again, that shows something for Leah. And it seems like they're agreeing that they're going to work through this. So in this post-confession conversation between Aaliyah and Lydia, we're seeing a different side of Lydia. And so, before there's that, oh, she's very loud, she's very out there, which people are different, you can have different personalities, but there's something about how she is intentionally choosing to ignore Leah's wishes. Aaliyah says, I don't want to hear any more information from you. I don't want to, which is, so the conversation started with Lydia saying, the reason I didn't tell you is that if I did, Uche wouldn't have had a chance. Basically, that everything would have been filtered through my negative experience with him. and I didn't want that. And then yet she turns around and does exactly that. Oh, his house is this, and on the surface it's like she's saying good things, right? He has a nice house, a nice car, his friends, his dog is great. But there's intent behind it. Because again, first of all, Leah has said, I do not want to hear this. I want you to stop telling me this. So she's choosing to ignore her. And then the other piece is, I'm telling you this to show I have one up on you. And that's in a situation where there's already this weird triangle that is going to be a problem. That she is insistent on saying that here's this role I'm serving, right, in your relationship, and there should be no role for her in that relationship. This is Lydia showing her cards here. There's something not so great underneath that, right? That goes beyond the tears and, the fairy tale. Because before there's empathy, because, who doesn't want that, fairy tale and that love story? And we feel for her that she hasn't had that. But this, this makes me nervous. Need some self-care after this show. Okay, so, yeah. I suspected earlier that Aaliyah was she goes into track star mode when things get tough, and that seems to be what's here because, and again, we can't say how much of this is editing, and, the producers like to mess with this timeline of things, but we go from her having a tough conversation with him saying, hey, thanks, your ex Lydia told me that you guys last had a sexual encounter 3 months ago, and that's awkward. To them processing that, and she says she's scared, but then she says that I'm 100% in it, I want to be here, and we're gonna be okay, which was great. we've resolved that, or we're resolving that, and that sounds great. To then her standing him up and leaving, not just the room like before, but leaving the whole experiment without explaining to him. I thought maybe she would even have left a note for him in the room, and he hears this over the speakers from the producers. And so again, it's showing, is this a pattern for Leah, that again, when things get difficult, that she leaves, that she's inconsistent, or did something else happen? We saw how overwhelmed she was in that conversation with Lydia. I wish she would have just gotten up to assert that boundary, to tell Lydia that is enough. With someone like Lydia, you probably have to be very firm with her, and that would have probably been helpful. But I wonder if something else happened, if Lydia shared something else and Aaliyah just shut down from it. But 4 episodes in, this is where we are. I don't even know who I'm rooting for at this point. It's all it's all so dramatic, but we stay tuned for more.